So my research domain is basically looking at environmental performance, environmental strategies, see how firms are adopting environmental strategies, and then what is the outcome of those strategies. So I've done a few papers in that specific domain. So this one was one of those where we were looking at, okay, top management team has been very much a current stream of research. And so we were looking at, okay, how does top management team and the composition of top management team, specifically as it relates to backgrounds of individual executives, how does that impact the adoption of strategic initiatives in the environmental domain? So we are not looking at, if the top management team is helping out with mitigating current and present environmental concerns. That's not the objective here. It's more like a more futuristic look at what kind of underlying strategic, how does top management team composition affect the adoption of underlying strategic capabilities? And the premise here is, the strategic initiatives, the genesis of that is in top management teams. I mean, that leadership team is where a lot of the strategic thinking, strategic planning is done. And so there are other papers which talk about if the composition of top management team is such that it helps recognize opportunities in a specific space, then it has a slightly different outcome. But if the composition is such that they view things more from a negative risk threat perception, then the outcome of the firm's strategy is slightly different. So that tied into this whole supply chain presence. And the way we argue it is, if we look at the realm of strategic environmental initiatives, they do have a significant impact on supply chain activities within the firm. So be it whether you're doing clean energy adoption, be it whether you are trying to improve your posture from waste perspective, as in packaging, recycling, things like that, all of these activities do, in a significant way, touch a firm's supply chain. So that was the whole, genesis and the idea behind this paper. So if that is the case, then our hypothesis is, if the composition of the top management team is such that they recognize environmental initiatives as opportunities, and to do that, it would help to have executives with supply chain experience, given the overlap or given the footprint in the supply chain space of these initiatives. It would help a firm in terms of adopting these what we call proactive environmental management initiatives. So that is the key piece of this paper. And we try to contextualize that a little bit by looking at gender and age as well. But the main thing is, how does supply chain management experience of top management team executives help with the adoption of a proactive environmental strategy for a firm? So that's kind of the background, and that's how we delved into this research and started looking at collecting the data and creating a hypothesis and testing it and all of that stuff.
So the background of the paper is that Anupam and I we have slightly different backgrounds. I focus mainly on top management team research, and Anupam is more in the sort of environmental green space. And so what we decided, we sort of got together and we thought that this would be kind of an interesting area of research, as the overlap of supply chain experience in the top management team and how that might affect a company's ability to implement these environmental proactive strategies. And so we thought, sort of just intuitively as we were talking about it together, that supply chain experience should have a pretty significant effect. Because if you look at sort of the types of jobs supply chain managers do, it seems that a lot of these green initiatives really do overlap well with the incentives of the supply chain manager. So things like reducing waste in the supply chain. That's both good for the economy, the environment, but it is also in line with what a supply chain type executive should be striving for. So we went through this process of collecting quite a bit of data. We both collected some environmental performance measures, and then we also collected for each of the, I think it's 452 companies in our sample, we went through their top management teams, and for each executive kind of went through their resume and coded whether or not this executive had worked previously in a supply chain type function. And so once we had kind of gone through that very tedious process and collected all that information, we then statistically used that supply chain experience to try to predict whether or not these firms implemented certain green or environmental proactive sort of initiatives.
So what we did was, I mean, in any empirical research, as you might be aware of, the key here is, or the challenge is collecting the data and making sure you have a good data set. So we did end up with a pretty good data set. We collected profiles on top management team executives from Bloomberg. We had, KLD, the Kinder Leidenberg Domini data set is frequently used in environmental research. So we had several years of data on a firm's level of proactive environmental strategy adoption from the KLD data set. And then, of course, we had a bunch of other what we call controls, as in firm size and profitability and all those things from CompuStack. So we had these three main archival or secondary data sources that we then stitched together to create a good 6-year panel of firm year observations to look at it. And obviously we do the empirical rigor in terms of looking at how a prior year's top management team composition affects a subsequent year's level of strategy, proactive environmental strategy adoption. So we stitched this data set together and we ran some panel regression techniques. And our findings did corroborate our main hypotheses, which is the presence of supply chain executives or the presence of executives with supply chain experience. And we coded that as a 1-0. So if the TMT had that experience, we said, okay, yes, 1, if not, then 0. So that's how we operationalized our constructs. But we did find a positive and significant relationship between the presence of supply chain experience in the top management team and the level of proactive environmental strategy adoption by the firm. So we did find a significant positive link as we had hypothesized, using upper echelons theory mainly in terms of corroborating our arguments, and so yeah, it did support our the findings did support our hypotheses.
So our findings were that having a larger percentage of your top management team with supply chain experience actually does enable the firm to implement all these different dimensions of environmental performance. So as part of our data, we had different dimensions. It's the KLD data, which basically scores companies on a wide range of environmental initiatives. And so we did find that having that presence, having that top management team supply chain presence was actually predictive of implementing these strategies successfully. So another thing actually that kind of is part of this paper, and is an important part of this paper, is we look at not only supply chain experience, but we also look at the average age of the top management team, and we look at the sort of the composition in terms of gender. And so what we were finding was not only does having more supply chain experience on the top management team predict environmental performance, but also the age of your top management team, as well as what percentage of your top management team was female. And so we found that having a larger female presence on the top management team did lead to improved environmental outcomes, which we thought was very interesting.
So, we have looked at one aspect from a supply chain composition perspective. Supply chain is a very dynamic field. A lot of firms are appointing specific C-level executives in the top management team as a chief supply chain officer, something along those lines. So we don't really specifically test for the level of importance that TMTs are giving to supply chain, and how is that impacting a firm's orientation in terms of environmental management. And we also know, I mean, there's enough anecdotal reports. There's one recently by Deloitte which talks about how firms are moving away from, moving more towards social enterprises, where they're looking very carefully at their social footprint, and environmental being a significant aspect of that. So one stream of research that can go forward is to look at how much importance is the top management team giving to supply chain, membership. That's one way of moving this research forward. The other is, when we're talking in terms of supply chain, you have to take into account the entire value chain. So we are only restricting it to within firm, but supply chain we know is cross boundaries. So how are there things from that perspective, from inter-firm perspectives, that also impacts this whole top management team space, and then does it drive strategy? So I think those are some of the key ways in which this research can be extended.
So we have a couple of ideas I think we're working on. I don't remember what Anupam talked about, but so one of the things that we mentioned in the paper is that what we're really looking at here is we're looking at one company's top management team and how that predicts that company's environmental performance. But really, if you think about environmental performance, it's a supply chain wide issue. So you can't just one company can't sort of unilaterally make decisions to be environmentally friendly. Their suppliers also have to sort of become more environmentally friendly if they really want that product to be, let's say, greener or more environmentally friendly. And so we would like to look, sort of take a broader look at through the supply chain, how maybe alignment between top management teams could predict those environmental outcomes for the entire chain as opposed to just one company.